Okay, hello everyone. Hopefully you saw my feedback on your introductions. If you haven't, definitely go look at that because that's all very important and it's very important that you address whatever concerns I might have had uh, for your final proposal. And don't hesitate to reach out if you're unclear about something or not clear on my feedback. I can explain it better. So your final assignment, um, in addition to the exam, of course, is going to be fixing up your introduction and then adding a method section. Okay, so like we said before, um, any APA paper is going to have, well, actually any primary source APA paper, meaning they actually did an investigation, it's not a review of other people's work, is going to have all these sections. Within this course, we're not going to do all of them, just the title page, introduction, method, references. So last time you did, of course, these three: title page, introduction, and references. But next we got to add the methods. And again, also fix up any problems I had with your introduction. On that note, we have your method section. It's not going to be on a new page. So just continue from right after your introduction where that ends. And then you're going to have the references, which are going to be on a new page. Okay. Um, so this should all be review, but remember your introduction is where you provide a rationale for your study, your hypothesis, a statement of the problem, why is your study important, review of the relevant studies, and kind of connect that all to what it is you're studying. Um, Near the end or at the end usually is going to be your hypothesis, so what you predict, and then and this should kind of flow logically from your literature review, from all the studies you talk about. And you also have a brief introduction to the methods. Um, so the reason we just have a brief methods there is because next we're going to actually provide the full methods where we explain in detail all the stuff that's going to go, um, all the stuff we did to actually investigate this question. So what exactly did we do? Um, who did we test exactly? How many participants were there? What were the materials? What was the procedure? Was it counterbalanced? Everything you can think of. But the introduction part is just an overview of this. So it's just a very quick couple sentences on here's what I did, just enough so that you can understand or you can make a hypothesis, okay? Or your reader can understand the hypothesis. Again, I just want to emphasize, be sure to read your feedback, read the feedback I gave you, and make any changes you need to. Also, just a few common errors I was noticing. Um, just make sure there's a match between your in-text citations and the references page. So make sure you don't have any extras that you don't cite or stuff you cite but then doesn't appear in the references. Remember that we use et al. Whenever there's more than two authors, the only exception being if there's like multiple papers by the same people, and using et al. Would make it unclear which one we're talking about. Remember that when a reference, and that's for the in-text citation, not for the references page. Also for the in-text citations, remember that if you give the names outside of parentheses, you're going to say and. If it's in parentheses, you're going to use the symbol. If you do use a quote, which I would discourage you from, um, make sure you include a page number. And then lastly, you're going to have the digits instead of writing out like 25. Okay. So yeah, we already went over this, but this is just a review again. This is in parentheses. This is out of. This is in. This is out. Um, you can do either, but just make sure it's formatted correctly. There's the et al. Part. Stuff we already went over. Oh, just one more thing. If you have multiple I don't think anyone did this, but if you have multiple studies that you cite together in parentheses, they should be in alphabetical order. And also remember the page number for quotes. Okay. So moving on to the method section, just it should be written in the future tense. So you should be talking if it's something you're going to do, obviously, because you haven't done it yet. Okay. So you can kind of use this to incorporate everything you've learned throughout the semester. Since this is research methodology, um, that should all be relevant to writing your method section. So things we're going to cover in the method section are going to be participants, design, materials, procedure. Um, each of these are going to be pretty detailed. Doesn't necessarily make them long, but just make sure you include everything someone would need um, so that they could replicate your study. That's kind of the general rule of writing a method section is if you read it and think, well, this is stuff I know, that's not good enough. You have to be able to look at it and say, okay, if someone wanted to copy my study, they could do so, right, by reading my method section. Um, so you're going to have these sections, like I said, participants, design, materials, and procedure. The participants is where you're going to describe who will take place, who will do your study, and some information about them. Design is going to be what is the experimental design, what were the dependent variables, the levels, was it within versus between subjects. Materials is going to be where you talk about what you used, the materials you used to conduct the study. So did you use an existing survey? Did you use certain stimuli, whatever it might be? That's what you should talk about there. Okay, so we'll go through each of these in detail. So for participants, it should of course say participants, not subjects. And you should of course include the number of participants, the demographics, um, and any special requirements. There's a couple more, but we're getting to those. So obviously the number would just be how many people are going to do your study, um, or how many people you would like to do your study because it's hypothetical. Demographics would just be any relevant information about things like age, gender, um, where you got them from, education level, anything like that. On that note, you also, if you need to, would list any special requirements. So a lot of studies we do, it doesn't really matter. Well, actually, that's not true. Some studies we do, you're just looking at a convenient sample, like we talked about. So you just whoever you can get to do your study. But in situations where you're looking at something more specific, like you're looking at, say, depressed individuals or anxious individuals or those with ADHD, well, it's important to explain what requirements there were. Okay, so to do the study, participants had to be this depressed by some metric or be diagnosed with ADHD based on some factor. Okay, that's something you would explain in your participant section. So in terms of how many, just think about whether your study is within or between subjects. Obviously, you would have more people overall if it's between. You can kind of think about how difficult your population is to recruit or how hard it is to get a sample from that population. But that's really kind of you. Um, you could also just think about when picking a number, what's typical in the studies you've been reading. So you should include sex, ethnicity, age, and any other relevant characteristics. So do they have, like we said, do they have some sort of condition? Do they have some sort of disorder? How did you qualify people for the study? So again, if I'm looking at those with depression, I'd want to list in my participant section, um, participants had to have this level of depression, however you measure depression. Okay. And of course, we need to include all this info because, again, if someone were to replicate our study, they'd want to know these things. And maybe if they failed to replicate our study, they'd want to know, was it some issue with their sample? Was it too different than ours? All right. Again, we kind of already covered this, but you want to specify the criteria for including participants if applicable. So how were they diagnosed with something? Did they need to be right-handed? Whatever. Other thing is, how were they recruited and what did they get? Right? I'm sorry, again, this will be future tense for you, but um, where did you get them from? Were they from a university, or where would you like to get them from? A university, a retirement home, a school, whatever it might be. Just make sure you list that. And also, what will they get for doing the study? All right. So, as we'll talk about with the ethics section, usually you give people something for participating. Could be money, could be course credit, could be a pat on the back or a picture of their brain, but make sure you specify that, whatever it is you would plan on giving them for doing your study. Okay. Next up is going to be the design. And by the way, these are each going to have its own little section, and I'll show you an example of what that looks like in just a bit. But for now, let's just go through those sections. So design is where you're going to state your independent and dependent variables, as well as their levels. Okay? Or rather, levels of the independent variable. You of course should have at least one independent variable because you do have to do an experiment here. So you should have at least one. You might have other variables in addition to the independent variable, you might have a quasi-independent variable, and you would list that as well. Okay. And then you also, of course, need to specify whether you're going to manipulate this within or between subjects. Okay, the next part is going to be the materials. So this is going to be any kind of stimuli, tests, surveys that you used for your experiment. And also, where did you get them? Again, we'll go through an example of what this looks like in just a bit. Last up, you're going to have procedure, and this is going to be a walkthrough of the experiment, or what the experiment would look like. Again, this is in past tense, but yours should be in future tense. So things like how are materials displayed, or how will they be displayed on a computer, on paper, spoken. Again, I want to emphasize that you want to include enough details that someone could copy your study. Right? And small details might not seem important, but they are. Very important to have instructions there. So what would you tell participants? If you're running a memory test, would you tell them, you're going to study words, remember these for later, or do you tell them nothing? Details like that can be very important because the way you phrase instructions can definitely impact how people approach the experiment. There's something known as number of trials. Actually, don't worry about that. That's not really important for our purposes. Order is another one. So if you're going to be, this is more a cog thing, but if you're giving, say, a memory test, are they going to study things in the same order as they're tested, or do they appear randomly? So if you study 20 words and then you get tested on 20 words, or try to remember 20 words, does every participant study them in the same order, or is it a random order? Right. And then counterbalancing. So we've talked about counterbalancing. Are you mixing up the order or the presentation of the stimuli in some way? That should also be covered in your procedure. Okay. So be sure to clarify, say you're running it within subjects and you're going to counterbalance the order. Well, that's something you need to explain. I just want to emphasize there, you don't want to make the reader think too hard. So kind of the more, when it comes to a method section, I don't think I've ever taken off a point for someone giving too much detail. Okay. Um, like sometimes I'll read an introduction and people go off on unnecessary details about, well, there was this past study and they did this, and here's, you know, all this stuff you don't actually need to know and doesn't serve a purpose. That's I almost never the case with a method section. So if you're kind of sitting on something and thinking, well, should I include that participants are gonna, hear the words versus versus read them, just go ahead and include it. It's not gonna, like I said, I don't think I've ever taken off marks for someone giving too much detail in a method section. Okay, and then just obviously make sure that this all matches up with what your hypothesis is. Make sure the levels of your independent variable match up between when you give your hypothesis and when you talk about them in your methods. Okay, so let's take a second there and let's actually look at an example. Again, this is written in past tense, but yours should be in future tense. So this was I gave this as an example of an introduction earlier. This is, remember, when we're basically having people study these word fragments here, and then they're tested on these whole words later on. And they have to rate the familiarity of each of words, and we're manipulating which letter positions they study. Okay, so you either get the exterior letters like in raindrop here, or you get the interior letters like the fragment of squirrel. Later on, you get those same words as well as ones you never studied. So volcanic, you didn't study a fragment of that. For raindrop, you studied the exterior letters. For squirrel, you studied the interior letters. And you're going to rate the familiarity of these words. Okay. So let's see what that looks like. So that's kind of an overview of the methods. Now let's go into the full methods. So when I mentioned different sections, this is what that should look like. So at the top, it should say method. I think it's method, not methods, but I won't ding you for that, since I can't even remember apparently. Um, you're going to have the word method or methods. It's going to be centered and it's going to be in bold. Okay? Then below it, you have another heading, but it's going to be off to the left, but it is still going to be bold. Okay? And then you're going to have headings like that for each of these sections we're talking about. Again, method, bold, participants off to the left, bold, design to the left, bold, materials, same thing, procedure, same. Okay, so that's what it looks like. Okay, so participants were 48 undergraduates from Colorado State University. Again, past tense, here should be future tense. So number of participants, we mentioned that. Some demographics, where did we get them? We got them from Colorado State, obviously. Female in the early 20s, that's all the demographics we collected. So that's all I could really say there. Number of participants, like we said, and then also what do they get for doing the study? So we gave them course credit. You could come up with something here. What would you give participants for doing your study? Okay. Design. Experiment one used a one-way three-level design. The independent variable being fragment type presented at study, exterior, interior, unstudied, which was manipulated within subjects. I should say participants. Okay, so like I said, this is where you state your independent dependent variables. So pretty clear here. This is what the independent variable is, what they're studying, the exterior letters, the interior letters, or they're not studying a fragment of a word. The dependent variable, I have two here, but you probably will only have one. So just state what that is. Dependent variable were familiarity ratings and identification rates. And I did explain what identification means earlier, so don't worry about that. Okay. So on to materials. Um, by the way, and just again to clarify, so remember we have the independent variable, but we also have the levels. So the independent variable itself is the thing you're manipulating, and then you can have anywhere from two to, or at least you can have at least two levels. You can have more. So this is the independent variable, fragment type presented at study, and then list what the levels are: exterior, interior, unstudied. Okay. Okay, now materials. So study and test lists were a total of 128 letter words, 8-letter words taken from Clear and Green 2000. Um, so notice here, this is what I mean by number of trials. So if you're doing some sort of test, you want to specify how many trials did they get. Trials just means like how many um, how many reports did they get. Now that's kind of a technical term, usually just used in CogPsych, but um, bottom line is like if they're studying, say, words or whatever, and you're giving them a test, you'd want to definitely specify how many words did they study, how many did they have in the test, or whatever, however it works. Okay? If you're giving some sort of measure of, you know, depression level or well-being or extroversion, then you don't really need to do that because you would just instead say they were given this depression assessment. Like I said, notice how I say where I got the stimuli from. So from Clear and Green 2000. So if you're using some sort of well-being measure or extroversion measure, be sure to cite where you got that measure from. Okay, I don't remember off the top of my head, but you should be able to find those if you go in. If you go into the articles, they should list where you get the assessment tool. Okay. The 130 words were split up into 4 study test blocks. Um, so again, just more detail on kind of the methodology here. Um, I'm going to skip over that because that's not super important for our purposes. Just one thing to note, examples tend to be really helpful when you're describing materials. So, I mean, again, it varies a lot. I wish I could give you a straight answer and say always give an example or always do this or always do that. But sometimes it just depends on the kind of study you're running. So for this one, rather than, just saying first and last letter fragments or interior fragments, just giving an example makes it clear what I'm talking about. So if that's something you think would help, then I would definitely do that. Giving an example. Um, let's see. So in terms of counterbalancing, by the way, sometimes it makes more sense to talk about in the materials, sometimes in the procedure. I'm not too fussy about that. It kind of depends on what you're counterbalancing. So in this particular paper, um, we had to counterbalance the words like sometimes a raindrop would appear as an exterior fragment, sometimes an interior fragment. So that's where, because the materials are being counterbalanced as opposed to the order, that's why I talk about it under materials, how we counterbalance them. I'm going to skip over this. This is not super important. But yeah, that you kind of get the idea. So if I were to talk about counterbalancing the order, which I think I do here, that could go under procedure. But again, that's not a critical point. So yeah, again, this is just the materials. So list whatever used in the study, and also kind of on that note, there tends to be some overlap between materials and procedures. So sometimes something might be covered under procedures. Sometimes, rather, sometimes it makes something could be either procedure or materials. It's not. You can kind of just use your best judgment there. It's not really something I'm going to pick at, um, as long as the information. Like if you kind of say something like participants is part of a section it shouldn't be a part of, well, that is a problem. But if it's something that could really fit either under materials or procedures, a lot of things do, then don't worry about it too much as long as it's there. Well, I won't dock you points for that. Okay. So again, procedure, just think of it as a detailed walkthrough through the experiment. So participants were tested individually in separate rooms on computers. The experiment was programmed into ePrime. ePrime is just a hardware we use to run our experiments, but that's what I mean, where you should report, what it's, how they're responding, how the materials are displayed. So we display them using this program. Would you just use a survey online? Would you, if so, which one? Would you use paper? It doesn't matter, but you do want to specify that. Okay. Remember I said instructions are important. So if you think about it, someone could certainly approach the study differently depending on how you instruct them. So if you tell them to remember something, they're probably going to try harder to remember it than if you don't. So that's where it's important to include the instructions. Participants were told that they would see a list of fragments and try to complete them, and later they would do a memory test which would be explained to them when they got to it. Okay? Again, lots of detail here for each of the study blocks. Fragments appeared one at a time in the top and center of the screen in black on a white background in an 18-point font. This is kind of what I mean here again. Like, does it really matter what size font it was or whether it appeared in the top or the center of the room? I mean, maybe, maybe not, but when in doubt, just include it. It's not going to hurt. How long were things studied for? Again, more instructions. I'll post this. You can have a look through yourself. Again, more instructions. How did they respond? So for us, it was just a simple typing in a number between 0 and 10. And yeah, that's about it. So there's another example you can have a look at. I'll see if I can get another one for you, because this one's kind of a cog example. But again, just be sure to include what you would use to record responses. So if you're using an extroversion measure or a happiness measure, be sure to cite it, because that's definitely a detail we need to know. Okay.